Welcome back to our conference. We are now going to have our first panel on philosophy, theology, and science. And the moderator is Dr. Sheena Mason. Dr. Mason is assistant professor of English at SUNY Oneonta, and I will give a more thorough introduction when she does the keynote address this afternoon. But it is my pleasure to turn the time over to Dr. Mason.
Thank you. And welcome to you all. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our panelists today. And this panel is centered on abolishing racism, creating a future without race from a philosophical, theological, and scientific perspective. Professor Jacoby Adeshei Carter, or Doc as I call him affectionately, is a professor of philosophy at Howard University. He joins the faculty of the Department of Philosophy at Boston College in the fall of 2025. Professor Carter's current research interests include Africana philosophy, social and political philosophy, value theory or applied ethics, philosophy of race, and pragmatism. Dr. Carter is the director of the Alain Leroy Locke Society and editor of the African American Philosophy and the African Diaspora Book Series published by Palgrave, Macmillan. His most recent publications include Insurrectionist Ethics, Radical Perspectives on Social Justice, Philosophizing the Americas, and he's currently an American Council of Learned Societies Historically Black College or University Fellow, and is working on a book project titled Race Contacts and Interracial Relations, a critical edition of Alain Locke's lectures on the theory and practice of race. I will hold on doing the other introductions for right before it is their turn to speak. So with that, Dr. Carter, I would love to turn the mic over to you and invite you to illuminate us for the next 15 minutes or so.
I'm not entirely sure how illuminating it'll be, but I'll say what it is that I have to say. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation to be a part of this conference and this panel. Yeah, so as Dr. Mason just indicated, I primarily work in the areas of African American philosophy, what in the discipline of philosophy we refer to as philosophy of race, and social and political philosophy. And within the area of philosophy of race, I try to carve out a position that in philosophical circles we call eliminativism, the idea that race is a thing that exists but should be gotten rid of. I think in the discipline of philosophy, we have managed, probably despite our own hangups, to keep pace with what we regard as a sort of contemporary scientific consensus about race, and the idea that race is not a biological phenomenon, as we've been hearing this morning from Dr. Graves. But then what that does for the philosopher and for a sort of humanistic perspective is raises the question of, well, if it's not a biological phenomenon that's under discussion here, what is it? And there it is a kind of social phenomenon. It's a cultural phenomenon, and as indicated in some of the earlier discussion at this conference today, it's a phenomenon that has to do with the creation and the maintenance of power, oftentimes to the detriment of some groups of human beings for the advantage or privilege of other groups of human beings. I study under a philosopher at Purdue named Leonard Harris, who developed a notion of a way of thinking about racism and race as a kind of exchange of those things that make life good and worth living from one population to another. So it's a view of racism and race as a kind of extraction that's predicated upon the creation of a class of beings that are the fitting subjects of exploitation and oppression for the advantage of other populations. And so, and over the years, it's sort of in my thinking about race, I've come over time to regard it as a thoroughly pernicious category and concept. Races exist for the explicit purpose of carving out those classes of human beings that are the subjects of certain kinds of victimization for the advantage of other groups or populations of human beings. So thoroughly not a biological category, but a social category, a political category, an economic category that often masquerades as various things, depending on what the illicit purposes of given populations are in promoting particular concepts of race, and to what ends they mean to employ that as a way of extracting from a population those qualities and things that make life worth living, and oftentimes by way of denying it to the population that they extract from. So that's sort of just a bit about how I approach the notion of race, how I understand it in my own work, or sort of the understanding that I've come to over time of race. And obviously that's just sort of laying out the problem in a certain kind of way, if you will. And so the important work, future work that I have yet to do, future work that I imagine is the aim and focus of participants in a conference like this is, well, given certain understandings of race, or at least given a recognition of the way in which race and racism have been fraught as sort of human problems, what to do about them. And so I try to do a lot of thinking these days about sort of given what I think it's fair to say there's a good consensus of understanding around what race is not, what it is, and the sorts of problems and issues that arise around that notion. How do we think sort of democratically, ideally, but also purposefully and intentionally in terms of and practically about how to approach the notion of race and how to approach racism, that those processes of extraction and exploitation that create the concept and then use the concept of race to further those exploitative sort of practices. How do we get our heads around significant and meaningful ways to sort of dismantle some of that apparatus, or at least find ways for people to operate and navigate and be in the world less subject to those sorts of social forces. I'll pause there and say I'm very interested in the conversation that I hope is going to unfold here. I don't want to take too much time so that I leave an opportunity for us to have some discussion. But I did want to just sort of indicate sort of how I approach this notion, the sorts of things that come to mind when I think about the idea of abolishing race, why it's important, and maybe at least speculatively some ideas about how I think we go about doing that, and why it's important to sort of, from a humanistic perspective, to sort of have that voice in the conversation that goes from an understanding that we seem to be coming to about what race is not, in the face of a recognition that race is still something in some sense, right? Like these problems are not imaginary. People are not operating under some sort of modern delusion when they think about the world in terms of race or in terms of racism. There's some phenomenon that's at work when we use those terms and when we think in those ways. But phenomena that need to be addressed in a certain way and need to be understood properly and not misunderstood for what they oftentimes purport to be, but rather brought into a clearer vision of what in fact they are. So yeah, I will pause there and allow for the introduction of the other panelists and look forward to the discussion we're going to have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing Reverend Dr. Starlette Thomas, who is the director of the Raceless Gospel Initiative at Good Faith Media. The Reverend Dr. Starlette Thomas is an activist, visual artist, race abolitionist, and archivist. Starlette is a natural shepherd of words and people, leading them to their most authentic and best expression. She regularly writes on the socio-political construct of race and its longstanding membership in the North American Church as an associate editor, and her writings have been featured in Plough, Sojourners, and Word and Way, among others. Starlette is the director of the Raceless Gospel Initiative at Good Faith Media, named for her work and witness and host of the Raceless Gospel podcast, which tackles that taboo trinity: race, religion, and politics. She is also the author of Take Me to the Water, the Raceless Gospel as Baptismal Pedagogy for a Desegregated Church, which argues that segregation in North America began down by the riverside. As an unrepentant academician and bibliophile, Starlette is a graduate of Buffalo State College with a BA in English, Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School with a Master's in Divinity, and Wesley Theological Seminary with a doctorate in ministry. Reverend Dr. Starlette, the mic is all yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mason. For the time that is mine, I would offer you a reflection that I titled Making Future Arrangements, a Raceless Gospel for Ex-Colored People. Race is an insufficient term for human description, as it does not remotely cover what it means to be human. It lacks the complexity of thought and emotion, is devoid of the ability to facilitate authentic connection or maintain relationships of mutuality and respect. Race was not created to root us in a shared consciousness of common belonging and interdependence. It does not offer a way of being, but a caste system based on what Frantz Fanon described as the epidermalization of inferiority and the resultant homogenizing narratives. Race inserts social meanings of worth tucked under our skin that we are later convinced are inherent and naturally observable. Instead, for the purposes of social engineering and the systematic ranking of human beings, the pseudoscience of race was employed to prove the supremacy of one people group over another, namely Europeans who self-identified as white in 1680, which coincided with the increased need for labor and the spread of the institution of chattel slavery in America. Thus, racial identities do not require curiosity, self-awareness, or creativity. In short, racializing identities are colonizing identities, maintaining the social hierarchy of the plantation, and today remains capitalistically driven in support of automatons. Robert Jensen spelled this us versus them way of being out in his book, The Heart of Whiteness, Confronting Race, Racism, and White Privilege, writing, "What do people of color have in common? That is, what makes the category people of color make sense? The only commonality is that the people in that category are on the subordinated side of white supremacy. Nothing intrinsically links people of indigenous, African, Latino, and Asian descent in the United States except for their common experience of being targeted, abused, and victimized, albeit in different ways at different times, by white supremacist society. Take that experience away, and the category of people of color vanishes. The people of course, don't vanish, nor does their color change, but nothing links them except the experience of oppression, and the group perpetuating that oppression is white. Another socially created category defined by power. Jensen proves that race is not an observable fact. Instead, it is what Charles W. Mills refers to as the racial contract, where in his book of the same name, he argued the general purpose of the contract is always the differential privilege of the whites as a group with respect to the non-whites as a group, the exploitation of their bodies, land, and resources. In fact, I coined the descriptor socially colored because, as pointed out by Henry Louis Gates Jr., who has seen a black or red person, a white or yellow or brown? These terms are arbitrary constructs, not reports of reality. based on an unnaturally curated aesthetic, namely blonde hair and blue eyes, though only 2% of the world's population is naturally blonde, and only 20% are born with blue eyes. It predicates a manufactured and superficial existence wherein all of humanity is expected to reflect this image and order their lives in service to it. But for persons of the Judeo-Christian faith tradition, one is either made in the image of God, that is the imago Dei, or in the image of whiteness. If the latter, then the believer makes a heretical confession, as white body supremacy determines for some human beings that it is illegal to be. Similarly, early race theories included creation narratives largely in support of polygenesis, or the belief in multiple creation myths to explain the existence of the various peoples of the world. Because of racism, the so-called human races could not even share an origin story. Polygenesis is blasphemy, especially since my elders told me, God don't make no junk. And so is race speech, which talks about human beings as if odds and ends, often called everything, but a child of God. In truth, racialized identities maintain what Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza described as relationships of ruling, which is not unlike the insider-outsider mentality voiced in Hebrew and Christian sacred texts, save the exploitative and dehumanizing power dynamic. Sean Kelly explains in Racializing Jesus, Race, Ideology, and the Formation of Modern Biblical Scholarship, the category of race existed in neither the ancient nor the medieval world. While the ancient and medieval world managed its fair share of hatred and exclusion, this hatred and exclusion was either cultural, against the barbarian, or religious, against the Jew or Muslim, rather than racial, against the Oriental or savage. Still, race was propped up by the Christian faith tradition and supported by the false binary of civilized and heathen. Heathenness operated as an embodied category, as much as a spiritual one. In a century that saw the spread of scientific racism and the parsing of human difference on the basis of skin color, skull shape, and size and other physiognomic characteristics, the broader category of heathen nevertheless retained a powerful salience rooted in ideas about bodies ravaged by misguided beliefs, bodies that needed the oversight of Protestants in order to be saved from themselves and each other. Catherine Gin Lum wrote in Heathen, Religion and Race in American History. In turn, this prompted the mass production of a blonde-haired and blue-eyed Jesus. The white American Jesus first rose to power and prominence in the early 19th century. Edward J. Blum and Paul Harvey wrote in The Color of Christ, the Son of God and the Saga of Race in America. But the white Christ has long been problematic. In response to the 1963 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama, wherein the 4 little girls were murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan and the so-called face of Jesus was destroyed, James Baldwin said, "The absence of the face is something of an achievement, since we have been victimized so long by an alabaster Christ. In need of supreme authority, race commits heresy and claims a theophany unheard of in the Abrahamic religious traditions. That is to have seen the face of God and lived to draw a picture of it." In fact, racism and racial injustice have not receded from American life because they are in good part the life-giving force of a dominant group's religion. Put simply, we cannot understand racial injustice without understanding the religion that feeds on racial injustice. Michael O. Emerson and Glenn E. Bracey II concluded in The Religion of Whiteness, How Racism Distorts Christian Faith. Robert P. Jones wrote about the white supremacy gene in American Christianity in his book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. Luke A. Powery concluded the same in Becoming Human, The Holy Spirit and the Rhetoric of Race, writing, "Through colonialism, whiteness fused with Christianity, thus blessing racial encasements," end quote. Further, religious justification for oppression has long shielded humans from accountability and ethical responsibility. All the opposing party would need to do was say that they were not human, ex-humans even. Race is also not synonymous with person. Mortal, living soul, individual, being, or earthling. Instead, the 4-letter word is an inscription written after the fact of creation and for the sole purpose of grouping the oppressors and the subjugated. Race narrates the storyline of the chosen and the disinherited in North America, wherein persons recreated as white are seen as full human beings. while persons remade in the image of Blackness are deemed 3/5 of a person, subhuman, due to their social condition. Nature mystic and theologian Howard Thurman shared an experience wherein it was deemed that he did not have any feeling. No doubt a carryover from American slavery, wherein his ancestors were viewed as chattel property. He tells the story of a little girl racialized as white who's about 6 or 7 years old and preventing him from completing his after-school job of raking leaves in her family's yard in his book, The Luminous Darkness, a personal interpretation of the anatomy of segregation and the ground of hope. When he threatened to tell her father, whom she feared, Thurman wrote, she stopped, looked at me in anger, took a straight pin out of her pinafore, ran up to me and stuck me with the pin on the back of my hand. I pulled my hand back and exclaimed, ouch, have you lost your mind? Whereupon she said in utter astonishment, that didn't hurt you. You can't feel. Because the systematic prejudice, antagonism, and discrimination that is called racism greatly reduces one's self-concept and discourages self-expression. But I am somebody. This innate sense of belonging to oneself was indisputable for Africans who were enslaved and still saying, and before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sums it up rightly. On October 26, 1967, he spoke to students at Barat Junior High School in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In the speech titled, What is Your Life's Blueprint? He said to them, number one in your life's blueprint should be a deep belief in your own dignity, your own worth, your own somebodyness. Don't allow anybody to make you feel that you are nobody. Always feel that you count. Always feel that you have worth, and always feel that your life has ultimate significance. I am somebody, because race creates and perpetuates a kind of rootlessness, anonymity, and transience. The statement was later popularized by the Reverend Jesse Jackson. He shared the poem titled I Am Somebody, written by William Holmes Borders Sr. during an episode of Sesame Street in 1972. The poem concludes, I am God's child. I am somebody. But whether your sense of self is rooted in the spiritual life or a religious tradition makes no difference. What is important is that we possess an understanding of what it means to be human that is neither self-negating nor dependent upon the antagonism of others. Because white supremacy culture thrives in a system of somebodies and nobodies. Somebodyness is what capitalism works against, preferring human cogs for its machines. This self-revelatory affirmation is the underpinning of dignity and personal power. Somebodyness is what white body supremacy fights against, using violence to convince us of our nobodyness because so-called non-white people are not viewed as the norm or the standard for what it means to be human. This awareness requires semantic sovereignty, that is, the ability to employ words that demonstrate one's autonomy and to name one's experience. It is to talk back to the history of subjugation and forced assimilation, which demanded the denial of one's given name, original sense of self, and the natural proclivities of self-determination. Because the violent assault on the dignity of a human being is a terrible wound to the spirit, whether one is of African or European descent, a Gentile or Jew, or born a slave or free. The inner cry of revolt against dehumanization in such situations bears witness to a common humanity. Beverly Eileen Mitchell wrote in Plantations and Death Camps, Religion, Ideology, and Human Dignity. It is no small feat considering the requirements of race to include the undermining of the self-concept. Mama recognized that it would be dangerous for us to live our lives trying to please racist white people, letting them set the standards for our identity and well-being, Bell Hooks wrote in Rock My Soul, Black People and Self-Esteem. White body supremacy demands heightened visibility, which overshadows the diversity within the human community and forces persons to participate in a narrative skewed toward whiteness and the so-called white identity. Persons not socially colored white are made to live both within and outside the margins of a racialized society. Consequently, transcolonial self-expression in the face of white supremacy culture denies the omniscience of its stereotypes and prejudices while defanging the justifications for single-story racism. It is with this assumption of personhood and assertion of unequivocal self-awareness that a raceless gospel for ex-colored people can make future arrangements. It is followed by the notion that racelessness, a divestment of racialized identities, that is becoming persons by an other than self-reference, which is other persons, the decentering of whiteness, and the abolition of this color-coded caste system are required. Semantic sovereignty leads to somatic sovereignty, and the very real possibility of reinventing oneself. A raceless gospel for ex-colored people moves us past colonialism, its tricks, tortures, and techniques for human trafficking, its forced uprooting of persons from soil and self. It is post-colonial and thus future-oriented, speaking for a time to come, and doing the work to ensure that we arrive safely and with a secure sense of self. The raceless gospel is proclaimed in preparation for life after colonialism, of dividing and conquering people and places and things. Howard Thurman makes plain our new way of being in The Search for Common Ground, where he wrote, "I've always wanted to be me, without making it difficult for you to be you. This is a future worth living into, a way of being worth embodying. The raceless gospel is rooted in a mystical spirituality of somebodiness, a belief in indivisible individuality, of selfhood apart from relationships of ruling that maintain social hierarchies. Through the praxis of womanist and liberation theologies and the future casting of the African American spirituals, its framework of semantic and somatic sovereignty is sustained by resistance through self-emancipation, as embodied by Harriet Tubman, self-actualization as formulated by Howard Thurman, truth-telling as named by James Baldwin, self-care as defined by Audre Lorde, and rest as devised by Tricia Hersey. This is not a modern-day proclamation, but a message on a slip of paper for days yet to be. A raceless gospel for ex-colored people serves as an alternative resistance to the hostility of racism and race, which is not an ultimate reality. It is making future arrangements for a community called beloved and preparing a place for you to be free from white supremacy." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Starlett Thomas. I have the distinct pleasure of also introducing Dr. Tade Soye-Eya. He's an assistant professor of cell biology at SUNY Downstate University in Brooklyn, New York. Dr. Tade Soye-Eya is a statistician and geneticist at SUNY Downstate University in Brooklyn, New York. His research is focused on developing novel statistical techniques to model how human genetic variation interacts with the environment to produce complex outcomes. He has co-developed two popular software tools for data analysis, Bridge PRS, which allows trans-ancestry polygenetic prediction to be made, and SIBARC, which uses sibling trait data to infer genetic architecture. A lifetime track and field athlete, he also conducts research on athletic performance and studies how perceptions of identity and race influence athletic performance. He is also a frequent contributor to the Critical African Thinkers podcast, where he discusses all things involving genetics, economics, and statistics. And he is also the only co-writer of a chapter for my most recent book, The Raceless Anti-Racist, in which we delve into what feels like all things genetics, but really it's only scratching the surface. With that, Dr. Soye-Eya, I would love to pass the mic to you.
Okay, I'm gonna see if I can share my screen. Let's see, entire screen share. Does that work? Okay. Does everyone see this?
Yes.
Hello? Okay, good. Okay, I'm gonna try to get through this fast. It's two papers. I tried to cut this down, but this is a talk on racialism. So I tried to differentiate that a little bit, explain what that means. Here we go. Yep. Oh, sorry. So almost 100 years ago and almost 1 year ago, two papers were written. One was called Race and Runners by Dr. Montague Cobb, and the other one was called Revisiting Stereotypes, Race and Running. And Ashina and I are on that paper. And ironically, the papers are almost the same thing. So we haven't really solved the problem in 100 years, but I'm going to sort of talk about the arguments that are being made at the time and what we've said about each one. So real quick, racialism, as we define it, is about specialization. Superiority is sufficient and almost always present, but not necessary. So what that means is, if we look at to the right, this is from Madison Grant, and he's the guy who did the racial immigration work for the U.S. in like the turn of the century. So he had this whole big long model about the Nordics and the Alpines, and here you can see he talks about the Mediterraneans being inferior in bodily stamina, but a lot better at art. So this is a viewpoint where basically groups of people are good at certain things that depend on their race. And the one really important thing is it's never about the environment. As you can see here, it's never about the social environment. These are fixed traits. And racialism explicitly rejects social explanations, except it also accepts all the previous ones. So what I mean by that is, we're going to learn about that from Cobb. So Cobb wrote this paper, and it was right after Jesse Owens. So he had a performance in Germany. I'm sure you guys are probably familiar. 1932, Jesse Owens went to Germany, and Hitler was in the stands, and he beat everybody in the jumps and the sprints. And this was actually politically really useful for the Allies, right? Because now we could talk about the Aryans not being so great. So in some sense, this was sort of pride for the US, but Cobb did not abide. So the first thing he points out in this paper is that we've always done this, right? When Paavo Nurmi, Finn, was the fastest guy in the world, there were all these theories about why Finns are so great. Is it the climate that's influenced the genes, right? Is it like something inherent? We've done this every single time, and today these things seem quaint, right? Today, if you look at Finns and genes, you find things about cars. So these are like a relic of the past. And he talks about some more. He talks about boxing was the Irishman's pride, and actually at the time that he wrote this in 36, Hebrews, Italians, and Negroes were now the dominant groups. And so he's, saying we were wrong before, and now we're sure that we're right. But that's what they said in the past, right? So racialism, because it views these differences as inherent, if they change, then the previous differences must have been social, right? Because it's the current ones that are not. So that's the first thing. And the second thing about racialism is the standard for the evidence is low. So after Jesse Owens set the world record in the long jump, there was a bunch of science, right, about how did that happen. And one thing that people said was, if you look at the animals, the tibia, I mean, essentially this is the foot, this is the tibia, which is the bottom of your leg, say the shin, and the femur is short. So the tibia to the femur ratio of animals that can jump really far, like kangaroos, is really great. Okay, that makes sense. And if we look at the tibia to the femur ratio of groups that were measured, obviously in the 30s, you can call that the Krural index. And the Japanese had an index of 80. That means the tibia is 80% of the femur. Whites had one of 84. Negroes had one of 86. Well, that's in line with Jesse Owens jumping really far. And that was just accepted. But Cobb goes a little bit further, and he says, well, wait a second. Until Owens, the Japanese held every record. That doesn't make sense. And then he says, Owens's index is 84. So this speculation is being made about Owens, and a statistic assigned to his race is used to explain his performance, but it turns out it doesn't actually explain him. But that's just sort of how the evidentiary standard works. It's always post hoc. So it's an explanation that could be. It doesn't have to, but it could be. And so now we're going to fast forward. So that was the 1930s. They knew what genes were, but not DNA, right? Or they knew what DNA was, but they couldn't sequence it, right? So It was discovered in 1879. The first sequencing occurs in 75. And from 1980 approximately to 2000 approximately, I'm going to call this the optimistic candidate gene era. So at this time, we can sequence DNA, but we can't sequence a lot of it really fast. So we don't have the genome. And we're discovering all these alleles, right? So we're discovering a gene or an allele that causes sickle cell, Huntington's, lactose intolerance, or lactase persistence. Actually, a few genes for this. And then after 2000, we get to this thing called the polygenic trait era, where we figure out that the reason why all the other traits don't work like these is because they don't actually have genes that describe them. They actually have many variants. I think Dr. Graves gave you guys a good intro on genetics, so you guys know something about that already. And I just wanted to point out that before the before the genome, there was a paper by Amby Burfoot in Runner's World, and that's sort of, it's probably the first salvo into the whole why do some people run fast? And his claim, and this is what people thought, obviously he was a little bit wrong about the genes, it's probably by around 5 times too many, but his claim, which wasn't strange at the time, was that once we have the genome, we can cure all the diseases and we'll know everything about ourselves, including why some people run faster than others. And so at that time, before the genome, people thought that speed was like a disease. It's inheritable from a single parent, or you could call this one drop, right? If one of your parents has the gene to run fast and you inherit that gene, then you will run fast. And so the idea was, if we can find these genes, and thought that there might be 1, 2, maybe a handful, then we can predict speed. And the racialist model said they won't be distributed equally among the races. So you can see in 2000, there's something written that black runners have speed genes. The idea here was, okay, fine, if that's true, at this point we'll know, right? We'll know that it's in 5% of this population and 2% of this population. We actually won't need to use race anymore, because we can just ask if you have the speed genes, right? You can just sequence yourself, and if you have the speed gene, you're fast. If you don't, you don't. And race will actually go away, even if there's a disparity among races, because we'll have something more precise. Of course, that didn't happen. It didn't happen because it turns out that complex traits like like speed are not determined by single genes or inherited from a single parent. For example, we can't find the height gene. That's because there's no common height gene. So there's no gene that all the tall people have. But there are thousands of variants that influence height. What this means is that for complex traits like height and presumably like speed, they're passed down by both parents, right? So it's not that you have one tall parent, and if you get the tall gene, that makes you tall. And I think we all have some experience with this idea, right? We think of skin tone. We take all the humans, we take the darkest 0.001% of people in the world, they're going to have 2 dark-skinned parents if they inherited their skin color from their parents. And therefore, if there exists a common genetic basis for speed, the same should be true, right? Because we look for the speed genes, we haven't found it, just like height. Now, for speed, obviously, whether the genetic basis even exists is unknown, but if it does, it is polygenic. So it's going to come from both parents. However, one drop and one parent models still persist. So as rebuttals to our paper, people wrote back quite angrily and told us that, for example, we were wrong, because at present, 79 of the last 80 Olympic finalists have had at least one parent of primarily sub-Saharan ancestry. That was from Steve Saylor. Another guy, Noah Carl, who obviously agrees with this guy, he wrote that 97 of the top 100 meter times were achieved by men with West/South African ancestry. And it is important to point out that throwing in West and South is a little curious, because the original racial hypothesis from 1992 said that South African blacks are related to East African blacks through their common Bushman ancestors. West African blacks, representing the Negroid race, stand apart. So this, of course, is sort of how racialism works, right? Is you have tons of groups of people that can sort of fit into any box you want. and that it sort of makes the theory work all the time. I'll get back to that in a second. One important thing is, ironically, one parent models do tell us something, and what they actually tell us, if it's not a monogenic trait, so if there's not a single gene, they tell us something about childhood cultural transmission. So, for example, American adolescent fluency in Fujianese is extremely rare among individuals without at least one Fuzhou parent. What that means is it's not that you need a gene to speak a certain language, but you kind of need a parent who can speak that. Now, you don't need two parents. One will do, but you do need that parent. So because that's a childhood cultural transmission model. What's interesting is the West African parent enrichment model, which is what they propose. They think it's a genetic model. It's actually much weaker than the enrichment of one Caribbean or Jamaican parent. And that's because this West African enrichment is driven by a relatively small group of people from the Caribbean diaspora and the Commonwealth countries. So when people are saying all the fast sprinters are West African, what they're really looking at is people from the Caribbean, people from the UK and Canada, who are also from the Caribbean, and people from the US. And even among people from the US, there's a big Caribbean enrichment among the sprinters. In fact, the majority of people with West African ancestry outside of Africa are in South America, and there are no top 100 meter times produced in Brazil or in South America. And of course, the majority of people with West African ancestry, in fact, West African ancestry that has less recent admixture, obviously live in West Africa, right? So it's almost 500 million people live in West Africa. And interesting, the West African 100-meter record, which is slightly behind the East Asian and East African record, which is strange if speed comes from West Africa, is held by an individual with a Nigerian father and a Jamaican mother. Okay, so what we've seen now is when we look at the model, we get to discount the past. We assume that everything before us was wrong, now we're right. We also realize that we get to use post hoc explanations. Anything that could be true is good enough. We also realize that the one parent models that we use actually describe cultural transmission. And so the question is, so okay, are we done? Is the subject put to rest? And the answer is no. Modern day polygenic era, we say, okay, fine, the single parent models are probably wrong, but could there be a two-parent model or a polygenic model for speed that still approximates the racial disparities? And so there's a essay from 2005, one from 2014. And what you see is the papers get a little bit more careful. They don't talk about race quite as much. They talk about East African versus West African, and they sort of cut the groups into two. And they still end up talking about race, but they sort of try to step around race to make this point. And we're going to talk about this paper here, and our paper is essentially a response to this. So this paper from 2005, so it's the first sort of non-racial paper. It makes this argument that West Africans are fast at sprinting, East and North Africans are better at the middle distance, and it says that, you know, even though it has a big part that race doesn't exist as a biological idea, it still sort of leans back into that. So here you can see it says, furthermore, all the male world record holders for athletic events from the 100-meter to the marathon are of Black African ancestry. Now, this isn't true today, but this was true in 2004. If your definition of Black African ancestry includes everybody from Africa, which is fine, right? That's an inclusive definition of Black African ancestry. It includes all these Black African Olympic gold medalists from North Africa. However, there was also a lot of papers written at the same time about how there's no Black chess grandmasters. And so there, in that case, all these people get assigned as Caucasian chess grandmasters, despite being from these same countries as the Black African runners. So we see another problem with the race model is we can determine it by what you do, right? Unless it isn't, of course. So if enough of the world, and what you can see is what Carl did with South Africa, North Africa, South America, West Asia, if we can ambiguously assign them to groups, then the racial enrichment argument is unfalsifiable, because basically what happens is to be fast at running is to be Black. So if you're fast at running, wherever you come from, you get assigned Black, and therefore it's true. Okay, so we go back and we say, okay, fine, his assignment is a little strange, but is he right? Have his disparities held up? They're sloppy, but do they make sense? And we look at them, and we look at the disparities in 2004, and we say, okay, let's look at the time before that. Let's look at what has happened since. And we have a paper that's all about this, about the 100 meters and everything. You guys can read it. I have a small amount of time, so I'm gonna stick to the 1 mile run, right? Everyone's pretty familiar with that event. Okay, so in the 1 mile, the history of the 1 mile has people from the UK that really dominate a long time ago, and then the US and Finland and Sweden, Australia. And then in 1954, Roger Bannister runs the 4-minute mile. And what you can see is after that, the Commonwealth countries really dominate. Here's a South African, which is, of course, not sprinters, according to the old claims. And then you get this sort of period that occurs where the Brits are absolutely dominant. And that's here, the 1980s, right? They win almost every time. So that's the wins by the Brits. Then in the 1990s, you start to see the North Africans and the East Africans start to win. The Brits get knocked down to 6. In the 2000s, they get knocked down to 10. That's when the paper is written. And the 2010s, they're way behind. And in the 2020s, quite recently, they're back. So the Brits are back. In fact, they didn't win the last one. They got third. They got a bronze, right? No, I'm sorry, they got a silver, right? So they got a silver at the last Olympics. So the Brits are back. They were here in the beginning, and they're back again. And when we look at the claims used to make this point about the North Africans and East Africans being good at the middle distances, we do see 3 decades of middle distance disparities where the British times were much slower than the African times. But what's important is that it's not just because the African people got faster. And of course, if you ask somebody why did the Africans get faster, that was social effects, of course. But the Brits got slower. And so it's real hard to imagine why genes can make the British people become slower. In fact, there's hundreds of papers that started being written around like 1990 to like 2015 about the African genes, but none on the fact that the Brits, and in fact all the Europeans in general, got a lot slower. In fact, if the Brits had just maintained their speed, they would have got 1st, 2nd, 7th, 9th, and 10th instead of 1st, 2nd, 23rd, 52nd, and 23rd, right? And so the big question for me was why? And, I have some, background in track. Obviously, 1986, when this sort of split happens, I wasn't really old enough, but if you are a fan of the sport, you sort of know what happened. So I have a video to play that's going to go through a quick 1 minute story of what happens. The video is in 54. Roger Bannister ran the 4-minute mile. In 1984, the Brits had the Olympic champion and the world champion and the world record. So they were completely dominant in 84. In 85, the Brits set the world record again. They broke their own world record and they ran 3:29.67. And that race is really famous because in that race, the guy who sets the world record holds off a charging, sprinting talent from Morocco, who later breaks that record a year later. After he breaks that record, British-born runners don't surpass the mark again until 2021. So this time ran in 85 on a track from 1985 and shoes from 1985 is not broke again until 2021. So here's the video. Let's see what you guys think. Okay, so what I have here is sort of a demoralization sort of claim, right? And in the video, you can sort of see that from sort of once that record fell, there was an idea pervasive in track that the African runners are just faster. And I said, okay, we can say that, that's fine and everything, but is there any actual data? So one thing in track, if you've ever ran, what you know is people run faster when there's someone else who also runs fast. In the 100 meter, it's sort of inexplicable because there's no wind, there's no pacing, but for some reason people run a lot faster when there is a fast rival, right? So when Usain Bolt broke the world record, Tyson Gay was right behind him to set the American record, right? And it's not just because of fast races. We can control for all that. It's not just because of wind. We can control for that. But there is a rival effect in the 100 meters. There's a bigger effect in the 1500. And the 1500, having a competitor in front actually really helps you with pace. So there's sort of an extra psychological advantage. So what I looked at is I said, okay, does it matter where the other person's from? So I said, okay, if you're an African runner and you have a fast rival, does it matter if the fast person in the race is European or if they're from Africa? And I looked at the African runners from 1975 to 2023. There were 770 personal records set by, elite athletes. And they have a fast rival in half the races where they have a fast rival, they set a PR. And you can see when it's a European fast rival 305 times, then they set a PR 174 times, so also around half. And the odds ratio is around 1, so that's a not significant difference. But then we look at the Brits. And the Brits only set a PR with the fast rival from Africa 40% of the time, but 70% of the time if they are with a person from Europe or the Anglosphere. So that's basically the US, Europe, New Zealand, and Australia. And then we look at 75 to 88. So this is before they got slow, essentially. And we see that there's no significant difference. We look at most recently, now that they've sort of returned, and there's no significant difference. And then we look at 89 to 2018, where they got a lot slower. And we see there's a very big significant difference. So what we're seeing is that European runners aren't able to run as fast behind a rival from the other continent, but the African runners don't suffer from this problem. We also can see that this problem looks like it's gone. And finally, what we can see is the times of Great Britain have recently got a lot faster. So this is the 1980s average. This is the 1980s world record. You can see it was only passed in 2021. And what you can see is it's dropping in accordance with the Norwegian times. And what's interesting is all these times in Norway are all from a single family, the Ingebrigtsen family. And currently today, the fastest middle distance runner in the world is a Norwegian guy named Ingebrigtsen, who identifies as a Viking. And he is sort of so he's sort of ahead, and sometimes they beat him at the end. Interestingly, another world record holder is also from Norway. I think the only European people to hold records are from the same country. And he basically came up and said that he just doesn't believe that. Unfortunately for him not believing that has made a lot of other people believe in themselves, which has given him a lot more people to compete with. But in any case, I think we have a case that can be made that we know why this is happening. We don't think it's genes, but it is real. So finally, to recap, we talk about race and sports, and we talk about all the things it allows us to do. It allows us to ignore all the mistakes from the past, make post hoc explanations, use a cultural transmission model as a genetic model, allows us to put people into groups to confirm whatever we think. And finally, it even allows us to describe why certain groups slow down, even though obviously, in fact, we know that race can't cause a group to slow down and speed up, but racism can. And that's it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, so we have a lot to get into between the three of our panelists. And as I'm waiting for more questions to come in through our Q&A feature here, I want to offer a couple questions to the panelists. And if you feel so inclined or inspired to unmute yourself and respond, then I welcome. And of course, more than one of you can respond to any of the questions. So one question I have for you is, how does a future without racism look? What does that world look like? This is a sort of thought exercise, and also I think an emotional exercise that I invite students to do in most of my classes, and I'm always interested to hear how people conceive of that future.
So what immediately comes to mind for me is a table and a calling to come home around that table and to come to yourself. I think when I talk about somebodyness, it means just that everybody is welcome. You know how people are when they get to a table. Mind your manners. Don't say certain things. Get your elbows off the table, or other people, put your elbows on the table, loosen your belt. But it's for me, it's a coming home to oneself, wherever you find yourself. But I see it as a gathering of sorts. And I see myself outside ringing the bell and saying it's time for dinner. The lights are on. You know, when the street lights come on, it's time to come in. And I think it's time for people to come in to themselves, to their fullest and truest selves, knowing that the people around that table are all family. I think the problem I have with race most often is its ability to divorce us from our kinship, that we're all connected. The propensity to other every single person just never escapes me. And so for me, it is a calling in and just an invitation to come home to yourself.
Yeah, I don't know what it looks like. But Yeah, I don't know what it looks like, but I think it's maybe worthwhile to just think that there might be a temptation to think that a world without race is somehow a more just world, or a world with less oppression in it. And I would shy away from thinking that necessarily. That is, a world without race, a world without racism might be a world that lacks a certain kind of evil, but that doesn't mean that it would be a world devoid of evil. Um, and the other thing I would say is like I want to sort of contextualize the question in a certain way, and just to point out that what I think we shouldn't understand about a question like that, or about how we approach the answer to that question, is we shouldn't understand that to be a hurdle to working towards a world without race. That is, one shouldn't think that a person who thinks that race and racism are problems that need to be addressed needs to first be able to answer the question of, well, what's the world going to look like when we get rid of these sorts of evils, before you can engage in the process of ridding the world of them. Because sometimes I sort of hear it that way. Like, well, first you've got to tell me what's going to happen to the privilege I currently enjoy before I can get on board with getting rid of that privilege, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that a world without race, the risk and what I think would probably happen is we'd still sort ourselves into groups, and we'd still, I mean, and you see this a lot in, scientific racism, where they'll say, okay, I don't believe in race. I believe in East and West Africans. So you just made it two more races, right? I mean, you just gave, a new name. And even when you talk to people, they won't date a Republican or, a Democrat, right? So I think people will still put themselves in groups. I think the good thing is, if there was no concept of race, you might still hate those people. You might be really, I mean, people do. People have a lot of contempt for people who don't have their politics or something. But you wouldn't use science to basically justify your claims. So I think it might be a little bit easier to imagine yourself as that person. So I think that's a big improvement. But I think that, race it's especially pernicious. But pernicious groups are probably going to exist, and that's something that we just have to fight no matter what. You can get rid of race, you'll have some other groups.
I think it's one's important, at least for me, to advocate for a fuller and freer understanding of human being and belonging. That while persons are going to cater to their worst selves and want to divide themselves off, that those who are subject to be attacked don't let that take away from who they are, which is why I talk about somebodyness versus nobodies. I think that's one of the main issues for me with regard to race, is that it reduces or diminishes the person's self-concept, their abilities to self-actualize or to escape. People feeling like there's no way of escape out of a white supremacist culture. I take great issue with that. Maybe it's because I'm inspired by Harriet Tubman, because I'm going to find a way. And I might be carrying something with me along the way to ensure that it happens. And so for me, I don't want to leave persons without hope. That even if you're in a structure, a system that seeks to dehumanize you, to criminalize your body before you're even born, that you can find a space within yourself, as Howard Thurman calls the sound of the genuine, that there should be a place within you that nothing can get to, no matter what anyone says about you, that you have to know that you're somebody, irregardless of what the systems or any faulty sources might say about the self. So me, it's for the preservation of the self, and maybe that soulish sense of understanding that I hope we can at least land on, that you can come home to yourself when everything is going wild and everybody's doing whatever they're doing outside, that you can have a safe space within yourself to go to.
Thank you for your responses. This question is from Malik Wilson, and this is for you, Dr. Soyea. What is the heritability of IQ in a post-racialism context? What is a better way of thinking of variation outside of race, since this seems to be such a sensitive subject, because notions of non-white intellectual inferiority were used to argue for various kinds of, quote, in quotation marks, natural oppression?
Well, yeah, this is a big one. I'll say one thing. I'll say is, even without race, we still make all sort of these same sort of same like problems that we make with race. So an example is IQ. So we know that in the brain we have something called EQTLs, and that is your DNA and how well it correlates with your RNA, which we think is your gene expression, right? So the relationship between your DNA and the genes that are being turned on. And EQTLs are highest when you're born, and they get lower with time, which kind of isn't that much of a surprise, right? When you're a baby, not much is going on. All babies are kind of doing the same thing. They cry and they eat. So their DNA determines a lot about what's going on in their brain. Now, when you're much older, say in your 30s or like 40s, now you have your DNA and you have what's happened to you for the last 30 years. That's going to have a big influence on your brain. So your DNA matters less as you get older. However, when we talk about IQ, the heritability of IQ, the claim is it goes up with time. This is actually a real effect called the Wilson effect. And it's sort of this sort of unfalsifiable claim that it's like, that's really interesting that IQ heritability is actually low for kids and high for adults. And again, if you pre-registered this idea before we did this study, you would say that's a negative result, right? You would say that that shows that the heritability is probably, environmental or socially mediated, because it doesn't kick in till you're older, till all kinds of things could have happened to you. But people don't care about that. And you also have to understand that as a geneticist, the heritability that we talk about, you have to understand it's interesting to us, but when we talk about it to the population, it's really misleading. So for example, if I do a study on height, now what causes all the variation in height? Well, it's age, right? Kids are short, adults are tall. It's not genes, it's age. Of course, we correct for age, and we kind of understand why, right? Why do we correct for age? Because, okay, we want maybe adult height. Well, then it's sex. Men are taller than women, so we correct for sex. But then with like IQ, we start to correct for all these things, right? We correct for the first 40 PCs, right? So when geneticists are interested in a trait, what they do is they try to grab all the variation that's not genetic, get rid of all of that, and then they get a value, and they tell that to the public. They say that's the heritability of the trait. And then people in the public think that traits have heritability, but traits don't have heritability. A study has has a heritability. So what I'll just say is, for a trait like IQ, what we see, for example, is that low IQ has almost no heritability at all, but moderate IQ seems to have heritability. But I think we can be somewhat cautious about that, because the population structure that we're invariably finding when we do all these studies is probably going to sort of dominate the top end. But in general, I don't think it's a problem in general to be post-racial when we look at traits, because it's sort of what we do, what we try and do already. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Joseph Graves, if you want to comment on the same topic, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, people have a really sort of false idea about what the heritability of IQ is. Some of the most recent studies, one which looked at 1.2 million persons of European descent, only found a heritability of their IQ between 1% to 3%. So that's incredibly small. So they moved away from IQ testing to estimate heritabilities to educational attainment, which is completely rife with all sorts of social issues away from cognitive function. And then they get it up to as high as 11%. And of course, they thought that was a big accomplishment because, genes were contributing as much to educational attainment as socioeconomic status, around 11%. But at the end of the day, you're still talking about 89% of the variation in this trait. However it's measured, that's not explained by genes. So the bottom line is, okay, we know that the brain is very complex. We know a lot of genetic variants are associated with cognitive function in the study I'm talking about. there are over 1,400 single genetic variants that accounted for 1 to 4%. So think about it. Divide 1,400 into 4%. That's how much each variant is contributing to the outcome. So we should never get bent over shape about the, quote, heritability of intelligence, because in fact, it's quite small.
Thank you so much. The next question I have is for Reverend Dr. Starlet Thomas. This is from Yez Marseille. We spoke years ago, and I'm grateful to have witnessed your soul-strengthening presentation today. I've contacted many churches in my region to see if they're interested in introducing programming that challenges the construct of race, but they're very much glued to the anti-racism and racist biological framework. Are you by any chance aware of a website, even if in progress, notating the churches, however few, that are moving toward a raceless framework when it comes to their values, sermons, and congressional programming? Google hasn't helped me in this matter. If you're able to see or review this inquiry, thank you so much.
No, but it sounds like a project I need to get on. I'm already, well, I've been invited, well, the United Methodist Church, I met with the Council of Bishops for the United Methodist Church. So they have adopted the raceless gospel with the baptismal pedagogy outlined in the book. I'm meeting with the ECLA, that's the Lutherans. I'll meet with them at the end of the year. So it takes a while, but I'm working denomination by denomination. I'll be with the Philadelphia Baptist Association in May. As you know, there's thousands of denominations within the Protestant church, and it is a work in progress, but I'm happy to catalog all of that. I try to keep track of everything that I'm doing, but I could certainly do more in that regard. Let me just be frank with you. I'm not joining any church in North America until all of them are desegregated. I find it to be the height of hypocrisy. So no, I'm not a member of any church. When I come in, I come to issue woes against white supremacy and all its progeny. But if you find a church that would like to embody this, let me know, because I haven't found one yet. Most of the times my presentations are met with angst and anxiety. And by the time we're done, everybody feels like there's somebody, but that there's work that needs to be done with regard to white supremacist identity. But for the church to own it, it would be to undermine many of its premises when it comes to the white savior complex and this missionary approach of saving the heathen. Much of it would have to be undermined. As you know, the African continent was renamed the Terra Nulla, the dark continent. So there's too much ignorance invested. And so this is why the raceless gospel, they are what Howard Thurman calls my working papers. This is my life's work, and it's going to take all of my life and maybe many others, but I'm committed to it. And I'm glad to know that you are following in those same footsteps. I'll see you on the path.
Oh, thank you. Rookie mistake, and I was muted. This next question is for you, Dr. Carter. Marcia Berry writes, I'm curious as to all the time being devoted to debunking ideas about biological race. Are you still finding that large swaths of people still believe there are actually separate human races that are biological in origin? I had thought that it is well known that race is a social construct and that racism is real with real life impacts. What is your understanding? Do those of us working to educate our communities need to still focus there? Can the panelists comment on how we can best work together to dismantle anti-Blackness, white supremacy, racism, and create a just society?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So yeah, I mean, I think perhaps if we think about the wonderful presentations that we had from Dr. Graves and Dr. Suet, sorry, I might butcher your last name, but Tade. Yeah, I think that it's a mistake to conceive of most people's sort of understanding about race as a view that they have as a result of, empirical or scientific study that they've done of the notion, right? In the book that I'm working on, the African American philosopher and Howard professor Alain Locke sort of begins by pointing out that, well, look, our scientific thinking, or what we call, at least in his day, our scientific thinking about race is oftentimes taken to kind of underwrite our practical and sort of professed beliefs about race, but really there's a disparity between those two things. So I think that sets a certain kind of challenge, right? So one might think that, for instance, if we could just get everybody to understand better the science about human difference and variations of populations, that then they will just have the right set of beliefs about race. But if it's not a scientific understanding of the world that's underwriting those problematic beliefs in the first place, sort of correcting their epistemology is not likely to sort of result in any sort of actionable behavior that tends in the other direction, that becomes anti-race. So yeah, that's sort of my answer to the question. I'm doubtful that giving people more or better knowledge about the phenomenon is really the way that you would dispel misguided racist beliefs in the first place.
Thank you. And to the other two panelists, do either of you want to comment?
I'll just say that I think a lot of people probably will say words like race is a social construct, but I don't think that means much, because I think you can say it's a social construct, you can still believe in it. For example, language is a social construct, but I still believe that I speak English and not French, and that's going to be a lot harder for me to be around someone who can only speak French, right? So it's I think that's something that's real popular to say, that it's a social construct, but I think it's sort of a distraction. I actually think that most people don't look at race as sort of a false scientific idea, right? They say it's a social construct, which is, I think, sort of a way to signal that they're not racist, which is fine, but I don't think that really tells us what they actually think about race. So I think that, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think that a lot of the people I work with, they certainly still believe in race, and these are people in genetics, right? So I've been at conferences with top people, and they'll tell me things like, oh, it's not fair that the European people can't run as fast. You guys have, different genes, all that kind of stuff. So I don't think that we're there yet.
Excellent, thank you. I just also shared in the chat a couple of citations from Professor Joseph Graves, who was sharing some of his own work and writings in this regard. I have another question here from Matt Cotton. What pushback, if any, do you see against the idea that racial eliminativism will provide greater clarity for addressing the effects of racism on socioeconomic groups, cultures, ethnicities, etc.? And this is open to any and all.
Sorry, I think I missed something about the question. The question is, what reason is there to think that eliminativism would?
What pushback do you receive against the eliminativist positionality, essentially?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I imagine this is common across the panel, right? But so yeah, I mean, so again, like, because what you're tapping into oftentimes, I think, are people's sort of commonly held beliefs and assumptions, like not the results of sort of reasoned judgment, but sort of beliefs that they've sort of inherited that are sort of part of the way that a given society is structured, and so how it sort of implemented certain practices and has conditioned the kind of belief in these things. So yeah, the pushback oftentimes is as you would imagine, right? Well, what do you mean I'm not X, right? or well, how do you account for the reality of, and then just rattle off a list of phenomena, right? And isn't race what explains all of these things? So then it becomes a conversation about, well, maybe if we step back and we're a bit more careful, we can see that it's a bit too simplistic to just say that race explains certain phenomena. But yeah, the pushback, at least that I've received, is as you would imagine, like people start from just a commonly held assumption that even if not biological, there's something very real about race, that the sort of beliefs that have been encoded in them are not sort of fundamentally misguided and mistaken, there's some truth to them. And so if you're telling me that the world isn't that way, then you must be wrong. And so that oftentimes is sort of the starting position.
As a bit of a personal anecdote, so Dr. Carter is one of my mentors from Howard University. And the first conversation we had, he outlined the different views of race, the different philosophies of race. And that helped me identify for myself where my philosophy of race was. And he followed that by saying, "You're not crazy." And I kind of needed to hear that, because I did feel a bit mad in some ways, right? What I was going through intellectually, my students call it emotional and spiritual work. It's a whole thing. And so, yeah, that just aligns with the kind of general reaction of a sort of cognitive distinction or separation or gap or something that needs bridging between how we're socialized to see ourselves in relation with others in the world, compared with the kinds of ideas that eliminativism can bring to the fore.
I think in
Yeah,
my
I'll just say, I'm sorry. Okay. I think it's discontinued, but there was a drug, Bidil. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but there was a race-specific drug not that long ago that came out. I think it was for heart disease or blood pressure. And so, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that if someone's doctor, basically says, oh, okay, because of your race, I'm gonna give you this specific drug that's gonna help you because this drug works, for your race. People are going to like that. They're going to feel like, oh, wow, this doctor knows who I am and cares about me. And now I'm on this. Now, the drug got discontinued. It didn't work. But I think it doesn't matter, right? When that's the environment, if you talk to somebody who's on that drug and you tell them, yeah, race isn't real, they're not going to be happy, right? Because they're taking this drug for their race, right? That was given to them by like someone who wants to like help them because like there's a race drug that works on those people. So, I mean, I think there's always going to be like some pushback there, and until it's not in medicine and drugs, at least.
In my context, I would say the pushback for me is it can take on several forms: physical violence, economic blowback. You can be excommunicated. That was certainly the case for Clanch Jordan, who tried to work against some of these false binaries. Also, there's this notion of betrayal trauma. That persons you're thinking you're working with a common confession, a common creed, turn their backs on you in support of white supremacy. So I think the risks are great. I think in my case, I have a strong sense of self, and I think that's what's needed in order to command this construct of sorts, that we have to know who we are innately, intrinsically, and then you can working from the in out. So there's going to be pushback, but I think if you are flat-footed in who you are as a person, however you identify yourself, me being a child of God or somebody, I think it's that you be rooted in that. And I think that's key to it. But pushback is inevitable. But you have to say it anyway, especially if you know it to be the truth. Even if it may sound crazy, Dr. Mason, you have to know that the work that you're compelled to do, you're called to do, you feel convicted to do, that you're supposed to embody it. And I very much feel that way. And I'm assuming so do the panelists. It's because you got to tell it. And so come what may, if you feel compelled to do it, stand up. And you can always call on me. I'll back you up. You're not alone in this work. If you want to call a thing, call me. Don't let this caller fool you.
Yeah, another personal anecdote, Reverend Dr. Starlett Thomas. I have called on her many a times, and I tell you, she has not let me down, not in person, not virtually. It's a whole thing. So blessing to have you and other folks like us in these spheres, because as you say, we have to say the thing. We have time for one last question. So maybe we could get responses from a couple of you in response to Selvi Sabihi's question. Any thoughts about how we constitute identities that are not othering and oppressive?
I love the question. And for me, I would immediately say, and it's very quick, what is the word you feel called or compelled to embody? What word made flesh do you represent? My name is Starlet. I got it easy. So my name means, brilliant performer, mark of excellence, badge of honor. What is the word that you feel called or compelled to embody? What is the word that you enflesh? I think it's important for persons to have some sense of self, again, to be able to individualize and separate yourself from everybody else and know that you are independent of everyone else and that you're somebody. What is the word that you've been called to embody, to enflesh? It's unlike anyone else's. So that would be mine. And then go and embody it.
Yeah, I guess I would say that to my mind, if one were to lose the idea that race is a kind of collective identity between folks, that doesn't seem to me necessarily to jeopardize any of the other many identities that any person has that they embrace alongside with race, right? So it's not as though, look, we need to have an identity of a sort, and currently race is it. So if you get rid of race, how do I sort of fill that gap? I mean, that's one of the sort of misleading and sort of pernicious things about the race concept in the first place, right? There's a tendency for it to sort of situate itself as one's primary identity or only identity. It's often ascribed to folks in circumstances where they, in fact, would rather not have it ascribed to them, right? So it seems to me that sort of jettisoning race thinking and getting rid of a self-conception and identity that is racial doesn't necessarily do anything at all to any of the other identities that I could occupy.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the panelists for participating in this way. And thank you to all of you who attended in support of and in interest of this conference. We are now going to have a brief lunch break from 12:30 to 1 o'clock. At 1 o'clock, I will deliver my keynote on the togetherness wayfinding, a little bit of a teaser. Come and hear me out at 1. In the meantime, in between time, practice self-care, do whatever you need to do. And we hope to see you on the other side of lunch break. Thank you again. Bye.